Welcome to Crash Concepts, where the economy, energy, and the environment are explored. Up next, fresh ideas and insights into the factors that are driving the world and shaping your future. Presenting information you can't afford to live without, here's Chris Martenson.
Welcome to this Peak Prosperity Podcast. I am your host, Chris Martenson, and we talk a lot about how the markets are defining things for us in some way, shape, or form. They do for me. I track the markets very closely, and I will know that we are about to get onto the next stage of the story when the markets begin to signal what they did back in 2000, what they did again in 2008. I know we've got another one of those moments coming, and I think this will be a bigger, larger, more conclusive moment than those other ones, as traumatic as those were. And so here we are, though. We are in the midst of the world's largest set of nested bubbles. This is going to probably carry on longer than anybody cares for it to. But here we are. And by nested bubbles, I mean the bond markets, the stock markets, derivative markets, sovereign debt markets. Everything I care to look at is pretty much overpriced at this point in time. But that's what you get when your leading monetary institutions decide to pervert the price of money itself. Guess what? You get perversions all over the place. Well, to help us understand that and talk about it some more, really great guy who we've had on the show before. Can't wait to have this conversation. John Rubino, author of The Collapse of the Dollar and How to Profit from It, and more recently, The Money Bubble with James Turk. Hey, very good to have you back, John.
Thanks, Chris. It's great to be back.
So The Money Bubble, it's been out for a while. Maybe we start there. So how's the reception been?
Real good so far. I think we're up to about 10,000 copies sold, which is generally defined as commercially successful by the publishing industry. So, and that's without the markets really going our way. When gold is going up and we've got financial crisis headlines everywhere, then you think the book would be more accessible and more interesting to people. So I'm looking forward to a really good 2015 for this book.
Excellent. Well, it's a great book, so we'll certainly let people know about it here. Now, we've been watching, you and I and everybody who's been listening to this, has been watching the markets for a while, waiting for something approaching sanity to return. And here's how insane it's gotten. I'm sure you've seen the same things. The bankers themselves, not the Federal Reserve, of course, but central bankers like the Bank of International Settlements, the BIS, ex-central bankers, retired folks. You had people like Kevin Warsh, former FOMC member, come out with his big op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. So people who are either the bankers' bank or just left the ivory, the marbled halls of the central banks are all saying the same kind of thing. I'm wondering if you're hearing the same thing. What I hear them saying is, wow, this is getting crazy.
Well, yeah, especially the guys who leave office.
Yeah.
Come out with a lot of worried comments. And part of that is that even though they were the architects of today's problems, they want to make sure that everybody knows that they were the voice of sanity at some point in the process, because they see it coming. And, the guys on the inside see the same numbers you and I do and probably come to the same conclusions that we're doing a lot of unsustainable things. But they've got such a stake in the status quo that it's very hard for the insiders to make any substantive changes. And so, yeah, they leave and they express concern. But we should never lose sight of the fact that these are the guys who created the problems in the first place, or at least participated in the creation of the problems. And the problems are real and myriad, and we've been talking about them, as we said before we went live here, we've been talking about this stuff for 10 years now. And things just keep getting worse under the surface, even though to most people now, based on government headline numbers, things seem to be getting better, but they're actually not. And most of what's going on under the surface in terms of bank derivatives books and government debt and now consumer debt and just about any other real financial statistic that you'd like to look at, they're all getting worse, which means we're heading for some kind of a replay of 2008, 2009, only with more debt to deal with, bigger derivatives books, more landmines out there. So this one could be much worse than the one that we just lived through a few years ago.
Well, it has to be a lot worse because it's a lot bigger. And the general arc of this whole story for me is there was a little hiccup in 1994. We had just come off of a double dip recession, which scared everybody off, and there were political ramifications. We have Greenspan in office. He says, not on my watch. And it was a little hiccup in the corporate bond market, and it was tiny by the numbers we talk about today routinely. And he freaks out and gives us unlimited reserve ratios in the sense that he did this sweep program thing, which we've talked about before. I won't go into it now. That blew up the money supply. There was Y2K, so they pumped some more in. Yay, we get this whole NASDAQ and other stock bubbles, tech bubbles, all of that stuff. That crashes. We get the housing bubble as a response. And so the general theme here is that the Fed seems very content with this idea that they want to blow the bubbles and then ride into the rescue. And of course, why not? They get feted and lauded. You can create the bubble and then clean up the damage afterwards and retire and get $250,000 a pop to speak. And I'm sure your card is full. And you have to turn away opportunities. So what's amazing to me, John, is that we as a nation have allowed these people to create the bubbles, ride in after the fact, clean them up, and nobody's really seems to be, at least in the main press and in mainstream culture, saying, wait a minute, were you the people who caused the accident? Why are we, it's like we have serial arsonists on our volunteer fire department and everybody's happy with that. I just don't understand it. And it seems to me like the Fed really doesn't get it, that their behavior is ultimately more destructive than helpful.
Well, that's one of the things historians are going to have a ball with when they look at these times. But that the same guys who caused the problems are the ones who are then tasked with fixing the problems. There isn't any kind of allocation of blame here. In most of the world, if you're the coach of a football team or something like that, and your team loses because you make bad decisions, you get fired. And same thing with the CEO of a corporation. But the people who are in charge of the economy seem to be able to escape blame. And I can't explain that. It probably goes back to general ignorance on the part of the population. We just don't understand what's happening, so we don't know who to blame for it. And so you see somebody like Greenspan, who is still taken seriously in the world. He writes best-selling books. He charges huge amounts of money for speaking engagements, and yet he's the guy who's the architect of the beginning of the biggest financial bubble in human history. And same thing with the people running investment banks. By any rational legal definition of what the banks have done in the last 10 or 15 years, they're criminal enterprises, and the guys in charge should be put in jail. They should be treated accordingly. As were the guys who ran the S&Ls back during the savings and loan crisis in 1990. Something like 800 S&L executives ended up being prosecuted and sent to prison after that relatively small hiccup in the financial markets. And what's gone on lately is so much worse. And nobody's gone to jail for it. In fact, hardly anybody even loses their jobs. They continue working and making huge amounts of money and living really prestigious lives after basically blowing up the economy and now putting us in danger of another 2008, 2009 times 2 or 3 in the near future. And so I don't know. It really is shocking that these guys are getting away with what they're getting away with. And I think it comes back to financial education. We aren't able to separate normal market fluctuations from financial crime. And so the crimes are being kind of subsumed within bear markets and bond market fluctuations and things like that. And they're not seen as the crimes that they should be seen as.
These aren't just financial crimes in my mind, John. You've got HSBC was laundering drug money, massive quantities of cash drug money, got caught. Nobody went to jail. And of course, there were people who specifically oversaw that program. It wasn't like, somehow we just lost track of who was overseeing these cash disbursements and their laundering through the system. Those all had names associated with them. Not one of those people, as far as I'm aware, has lost their job, been demoted or fired, or let alone gone to prison. And we have really horrible cases, too, coming out of other U.S. banks where they do things like put people into the homeowners mortgage modification program, homeowner assistance, the HAMP thing, right? And shove them into that whole thing and then maneuver to make sure that those people get lost in the system so that the checks that they're sending into it don't clear in time. So now they're technically in default and then seize their property after knowingly putting people into default situations. So whether there's a law against that, which I hope there is, the lack of moral compass in that story is extraordinary. And so when you say, our banks are sort of too big to jail and are doing some funky things, I'm detecting a severe lack of esprit de corps, of that we're all on the same team in this particular story.
Well, yeah. I mean, you nailed it, basically, that there are actual people doing these things. Corporations don't do things. They're just a place where people do things. And so individuals have done each one of these things, and presumably they knew they were illegal, because it's pretty clear in retrospect that this stuff was at a minimum unethical and usually overtly breaking the law. And where is the media in all this? You would think you could win a Pulitzer Prize pretty easily by just naming names, going in and spelling out exactly what was being done in these big banks and the government institutions that support them, and then coming up with a list of the people who did those things, And you don't see that anywhere except to an extent in Rolling Stone, of all places. Matt Taibbi's doing some really good investigative work. But you would think this would be something that the New York Times and the Washington Post and pretty much every big newspaper otherwise, anywhere else, would be all over, because this is how you make a name for yourself. You can get famous, win awards, increase your circulation, and make more money by breaking big, important stories. And this is arguably one of the biggest, most important story of our time. The financial system devolving into basically a branch of the mafia and taking the government with it. And yet you don't see it. I can't explain that either, except to the extent that a lot of big newspapers and magazines are owned by corporations now who might not see it as in their interest, because a lot of it will come back to bite them at some point. But man, it seems like there's a wide open door here for some enterprising reporter to win a Pulitzer.
Well, I feel like that wide open door is where you've got your nose and I've got my nose. It does create opportunities, which is that for people who want to, are a little bit curious, want to start piecing the story together for themselves, there's plenty of opportunity to do that. And by the way, you have to, because for the most part, the big mainstream media outfits are not telling the story that needs to be told. Not on any dimension I can possibly tell. That the context necessary to understand what's going on in the Ukraine is not that hard. Go back to about 1989 and you can figure out what the story is. Mostly I had to piece together really the United States involvement in Ukraine from alternative media sources, from foreign news sources, even Putin's own 4.5-hour-long press conference where he gave this entire history of Crimea going back to 1700s with essential context, all of that. So we live in this context-free environment where things just sort of happen and you just sort of have to accept that banks are too big to jail and it's all too complicated and all of that. And yet at the same time, I know you've got a series of articles out right now sort of articulating that the markets are potentially not what they seem. If this all feels a little bit like we're all unknowing participants in the Truman Show, like we're all Truman. I don't know if you saw that movie with Jim Carrey where he's just this guy in a movie set and doesn't know it. That's how I kind of look at the markets now, that they tell me almost nothing useful anymore, which is a problem for me because I've always relied on markets as being my personal canaries, right? I would carry them around with me, and if the canary died, I would know that something was happening. I don't really trust the markets to tell me much anymore. Most recently, the biggest piece for that was looking at the Portugal bank, Banco Espírito Santo, right?
Yes.
This thing it goes belly up. I mean, it defaults on some of its bonds just for humor, right? Goldman had a buy rating on that stock until this morning, right? It's destroyed, like as a stock. All right, we're going to take the buy rating on that off. And none of the rating agencies were out there picking this thing up. The credit default swap spreads on this were only 173 basis points a month ago, shot up to 370 basis points after they defaulted. I'm like, what are you talking about? That should be 1,500 basis points minimum for a defaulted company, minimum. And that's the world we live in.
Yeah, and one of the tricky things about Espírito Santo is that it's part of a series of interlocking corporations where one owns 20% of the other and a third owns a bunch of both. And so when one piece of that interlocking chain of different financial companies gets into trouble, it reverberates through the rest of the system. So that's what happened here, is one of the companies defaulted on some debt, which caused the other companies to run into trouble. And so you've got this system that is so opaque that no analyst can really get in there and figure out who owns what and what the impact of something over here is going to be on the other. You just can't do that when something reaches a certain level of complexity. And so one piece of this thing blew up and it took the rest of it with it. Now, you can argue that the whole global financial system is in basically the same boat. Even an entity like Goldman Sachs, which owns all the different pieces, or JP Morgan Chase, they've got derivatives books, and they've got securitization operations, and they've got prop trading desks. These are all within the same corporate umbrella, but they're all separate operations, and any one of which can blow up and take the rest of the system down with it. And then you've got cross ownership among all these big banks, and you've got loans from one big bank to another big bank, and we can't, as individual human beings, manage the complexity of a system like this. We can't dig in there. Either the best banking analyst in the world cannot make sense of all this. So we're always going to be surprised by what the system does now, because it's at a level of complexity that's beyond the comprehension of an individual human brain. And so we should expect more stuff like this to happen. I mean, that's what happened in 2009, and when the derivatives system blew up. You had insurance companies getting into trouble and threatening to take down the whole global financial system. And we're, if anything, more complex and more financially fragile now than we were, and more opaque. Nobody can figure out what's going on here. Not the regulators, not bank analysts, certainly not the government bureaucrats and the politicians that have to make rules governing all this stuff. So, we had a chance after any of the last few financial crises, whether it was junk bonds or tech stocks or housing, to simplify the system. We could have gone back instead of forward in terms of imposing regulations and separating out different kinds of banking functions, and we didn't. We went the other way. We deregulated everything. And so now we've got a system that is so intertwined, you can't pull the pieces apart and make any sense of it. So we will only, as with so many other things now, understand what's going on in retrospect when historians sort through the rubble of this system and try to figure out exactly who did what to whom and what the effects were. But all we can do now is just live through it and know there's going to be a huge amount of complexity leading to a huge amount of volatility, leading to some kind of a crisis out there, whether it's a debt collapses in the 1930s or a hyperinflation like Weimar Germany, or some new hybrid that is based on all the derivatives that we don't understand, but that are totaling like $2 quadrillion now in notional value. We don't know what it's going to be, but we know some kind of a crisis has to come from this kind of complexity and fragility and instability.
Now, I think the Espirito Santo story tells the tale in microcosm. It sounds, I'm not as familiar with all the holding companies and their formulations, but just the way you described it, it sounds a little bit like Enron, where potentially, you've got this. The reason a lot of corporations go into complex corporate structures and shells is so that they can hide stuff and do stuff, right? So Company A makes a loan to Company B. It gets swapped out as an asset on the books of the Company A. So they take a financial snapshot and say, hey, look, we've got this asset. And they don't record the liability as being a consolidated liability funneling back through. There's just games like that. That's what Lehman was doing. It's like there's all sorts of games being played all the time. And as you mentioned, regulation has actually softened, not gotten any harder across this. We've got the mark to fantasy rules now. So financial institutions can just sort of guess what they think their assets are worth and call that the true number. And when you get right down to it, with all of these derivative products that are sitting out there, everybody has this sense of safety. Because if my Greek bonds that I bought go bad, that's okay. I bought credit default swap insurance. If the stock market really starts to go down, it's okay, because the Fed will provide the support and come in and not allow that to happen. That type of thinking seems to be about as prevalent as I've ever seen it. And again, there's a lot of opportunities to curl my toes and make my hair stand up straight. But this last week's article was the one about how junk bonds are now at record low yields, record high issuance rates, and the number of them that have covenant light loan agreement attachments to them is now over 51%. So people are just so hungry for yield. They're in junk trading with a 4 handle. I'll take 4.9% on this junk bond. I don't need any covenants. That's okay. I'm sure that, Flighty McSpeedy's company is going to be good for it. It's insane. And here we are.
And this is by design, Chris. The government is actively trying to force people further and further out on the risk spectrum by lowering interest rates to the point where you flat out can't live if you're a retiree. You've got a bunch of cash that once yielded 6, 7, 8% and was enough to live on. Now it yields 0.2% in a 6-month CD. And so you basically starve if you have to live off the income from your savings. So the only choice is to, well, two choices. One is you eat your capital. You start spending the money that you've saved, or you find something that yields a little bit more. And so you've got all this supposedly safe capital pouring into riskier and riskier assets like junk bonds because the people feel that they have no choice. And so pension funds are doing the same thing. That money is supposed to be managed very conservatively, but it's going more and more into equities and junk bonds and real estate. And the reason for that is that that's the only way to make their targets. So we're creating fragility at every level. These retirees who thought they had enough to live on now have a portfolio of junk bonds and equities with probably some global bond funds thrown in for good measure. And those are very volatile instruments. So eventually, even in normal times, those kind of things have big corrections. So you're going to see a lot of people who can't afford to lose anything of their capital, losing 30, 40, 50% in the next market correction. And that's if we just have a normal correction in junk bonds. So you could see 60, 70, 80% losses on a lot of these things. And so the pension funds of the world can't afford that. Retirees can't afford that. But that's the world we've created. And you really have to wonder about the policymakers who are doing this right now, because do they not understand this? Or is there some later stage in the plan in which they want this to happen? And that they're going to do something at that point that is in their best interests, as opposed to the best interests of the people that they're impoverishing. I don't know. I'm not sure which one scares me more, whether these guys are clueless or whether they have a plan. And the plan is in some way to harvest us. That I don't completely understand how they want to do it, but if they're attempting to do it, then they must see some benefit out there in the future.
Yeah. So it's a choice. Do you want your ship that's being charted through uncharted waters? Do you want the clueless idiot for the captain, or the evil genius?
Yeah.
Who's piloting this ship? And I vacillate, John, between those, and I'm convinced more and more that these are just normal people with egos. I'm sure they have plans. Most plans don't survive first contact with the enemy. We've never been in a situation this complex, this intertwined. And most of it, though, this is the part I don't understand, how so many so-called investors, I have to put air quotes up when I say that word now, investors, they're all speculators, have thrown all caution to the wind, because one of the things that's really required, there's a lot of things that are required to keep this particular set of inflated asset bubbles fully inflated, right? There can't be, oil can't get any more expensive, probably. That's not going to help anything out. And we need to have continued access to growth, right? If that growth genie doesn't return and bestow its magic on our land, a lot of these numbers don't work out. There really can't be any series of defaults. We can't go down a deflationary path at all, or all of these junk bond things we're talking about will just come roaring up as one of many heads of the Hydra to tear this thing apart. But mostly what's really, really required is that we don't have any geopolitical fracturing. Europe and US and Japan all have to be singing from the same hymn book. We can't really have any further devolution in the relationship between China and the US, Russia and the US. And yet, this past month has been extraordinary. And I'd love to get your observations on this, because you've been tracking things around the dollar. The number of countries that have been openly calling for an end to the petrodollar, including France. France is in that club now, right? Those stunning announcements by China's president about how chaotic and bad it would be if there was an actual conflict with the United States. That's kind of a harsh sort of a thing to hear from the president of China. Russia, obviously not happy with us at this point in time. And now recently Germany, not one, not two, but 3 spying scandals now. And they've really started to distance themselves, and they're very unhappy with the U.S. And I put all of that together and I say, hey, maybe somebody might want to say there's a risk here somewhere. I can't detect that risk if it's being perceived by these so-called investors, I can't detect it in the markets anywhere.
Well, yeah, the markets are behaving as if we're in the best of all possible worlds. And the reason that that's happening is that these are not free markets anymore. They're all manipulated. The U.S. stock market is the perfect case study here, where we've lowered interest rates to the point where corporations can now borrow very cheaply and buy back their stock. And they're doing it on a vast scale because Gordon Long over at Macro Analytics ran the numbers the other day and found that if you've got a 2 or 3% dividend on your stock, it actually makes you money to borrow at a slightly lower rate than that and then buy back your stock, collect some tax breaks along the way, and it's a cash flow positive strategy. So a lot of these companies are now buying back their own stock without any regard to the price of the stock, other than the fact that it's low enough to give them this tax break free cash flow strategy when they borrow money to buy it back. And so you've got all this indiscriminate buying going on, which is pushing up equity prices. And at the same time, you've got the world's central banks suddenly intervening in the equity markets, which is something that they probably did all along, but secretly and on a fairly small targeted scale. Now they're doing it indiscriminately. 3% of a given country's stock market, they just go in and buy each stock, 3%. And it looks like it's spreading and the scale is growing really dramatically lately. So you've got basically an unlimited amount of money because these global printing presses are effectively unlimited with which to buy equities. And so the supply of equities are dropping because corporations are buying them back in at the same time that the world central banks are creating new currency and buying the remaining equities indiscriminately. So it shouldn't be a surprise that equity prices are going up, but you still don't want to see that. It's still not a good thing because it destroys the price signaling mechanism of the equity markets. It used to be that when a given stock went up, it told you something. It told you that whatever that company is selling, you should make more of it, or you should use less of it. And it doesn't tell us that anymore. Stocks are going up fairly indiscriminately. And so that's yet another pricing signal that we used to be able to use. As you said, markets used to tell us things. Well, they don't tell us anything anymore, other than the fact that they're being manipulated. So we should be really leery of anything they do tell us. But obviously this can't end well. But the fact that a printing press, a modern printing press, which is basically an electronic system now in which governments can just press send and increase bank reserves around the world. When that's fully operational as it is today, it's basically unlimited. So you really don't know how far this can go because these guys don't have any technical limits to how much money they can pump into the stock market or the bond market or use it to manipulate foreign exchange or depress the gold market or whatever, or name your market. It's all being manipulated. And they have unlimited ammo right now. So we don't know, because this is uncharted territory, how far the imbalances can go, how big these bubbles can eventually reach before they eventually blow up. So this is completely uncharted territory, and all you can say with certainty is that the bigger that these imbalances become, the more extreme the correction has to be to bring them back into balance. But you can't say anything about the timing because we don't know how far the process can go.
Well, it can go further than anybody expects. I think bubbles, they get as large as the gap between reality and hope. And we have a huge gap right now. I think reality is very clearly saying, hey, world, you're facing some real limits, right? There's only so much bluefin tuna the oceans can offer. There's only so much oil that will come out of the ground. There's only so much fresh water, particularly in certain regions. There's only so much earth that can be plowed and planted. So we're facing for the first time real limits. And I think those are going to obviously have to put a cap on the percentage growth we can expect. So in times past when the limitation was, it's a function. Tell me how many people you have. Tell me how much money is floating around and how much resources you got. And I'll tell you how fast your economy is going to grow. And by the way, it's sort of constrained by things like productivity and technology and the workforce and all that stuff. But you could just sort of count on that happening. You can't anymore because obviously to grow 3% per year is easier when you're smaller than when you're larger. We have a very, very large world economy at this point. So adding a global 3% gets just trickier every year. And more importantly, growth requires resources, real stuff. And the Fed is over there in fantasy world thinking that, hey, it's money that creates, you create enough money and real stuff follows. And I hold the opposite view. Money is an expression and needs to be in relation to real stuff. And so I don't think that the main architects of this system have yet cottoned on to the idea that the system needs to run at a rate that it can't run at anymore. And how are we gonna get around that? So there's just a big issue sort of lurking there, which I think the stock market might look forward a quarter, two, maybe 4 quarters, maybe a little further. But the kinds of things that are really facing us, you have to have a 10-year vision for now, a 20-year vision to really hold. And theoretically, the body politic is supposed to have that longer view. And boy, it doesn't.
Yeah, Chris, you're doing especially interesting work on energy right now. And I think it's fascinating that the U.S. is in the middle of a oil and gas boom right now. We're now producing more oil than we produced at any time in the past 15 or 20 years, I think. Mm-hmm. And yet, the price of oil is still over $100 a barrel. Yeah. So we are clearly at the end of the cheap oil era. We can produce as much as we want to now, but we can't do it cheaply anymore. And the internal structure of the fracking boom and everything makes it look like even today's price probably isn't sustainable. And maybe we can produce a lot more in the future, but it's going to be at 120, 130, 140, whatever dollars a barrel, without any global geopolitical issues going on. So clearly we've hit the limit to cheap energy, and we're going to have more and more expensive energy in the future. And which is, on the one hand, great for clean tech. That means a kind of an open market for solar now. Just this huge vacuum that will suck in solar panels for the next 20 or 30 years and make the best solar companies very profitable investments. But on the other hand, that's not going to lower the average cost of energy, because we're still so dependent on fossil fuels. And that's going to act like this huge tax increase going forward on a system that is already struggling. We've already got overwhelming amounts of debt, and now we're going to have increasing energy costs going forward, irregularly, but still in general increasing. And so we're reaching limits at a time that we're borrowing more and more and becoming more and more fragile and less able to deal with the consequences of those limits. So somewhere out there is the collision between those two trends, and when it happens, it'll be something that nobody alive today has lived through, certainly.
No, it's a whole new thing. And what's interesting is when I talk with people who are in their 20s, many of them get that, and they really are just like, what are you older people doing? What are you up to? I don't get it. Because it really looks like just clinging to the status quo for the sake of it all. And so to help us get our minds around when it might end, let's go back to a comment you just made, because I think in the micro we can sometimes understand the macro. So you articulated a process. Here's the process. A company has shares out on the market, and it has to pay a dividend of, I'll make a number up, 3%. And it discovers it can borrow money at 1%, and in the short-term paper market. And so it can go out and borrow money. It'll have more debt on its balance sheet and take that money and go buy shares in the open market. And again, doesn't matter what the price is, because if you have a dividend yield of 3% and you're buying those shares with 1% money, and you have a tax credit or benefit that happens in the process with that, the whole thing pencils out. And guess what? CFOs should be doing that because it makes good financial sense. Can you unwind that process for me? What happens when that has to go the other direction, or does it?
Well, eventually you reach a point where you can't buy back any more stock. In the extreme case, there's none left. You buy that last share of stock and you're no longer a public company. And big corporations aren't going to get to that point. So at some point they have to stop. And if they need to raise capital, because remember, they've taken on a huge amount of debt to buy back the stock that they bought back. And at some point they need to raise capital to offset that debt. And really the only way to do that, you can't issue more debt to pay back debt, especially at these low interest rates, because you're not going to see rates drop to make that work. You have to issue stock. so at some point, this unwinds via huge increases in stock issuance by major corporations. And so all this buying pressure that we see now that are pushing up the value of stocks, it'll reverse. We'll see selling pressure on the part of corporations trying to issue stock to raise capital, and that will push down the value of the average equity in the U.S. and around the world. And that's just emblematic of all these trends. Eventually they have to reverse out. They can't go on forever. And then you'll see the opposite effect on the markets. Right now it's positive. We're taking on debt, we're buying assets, asset prices are going up. Well, at some point we have to pay off that debt, and we have to do that by selling the same things that we were buying in the past, and that's going to push down prices. So even leaving aside a crisis, even if we don't have anything serious happen as far as a disruption in the derivatives markets or geopolitically or whatever, you still see us building up huge amounts of selling pressure out there on the things that are going up right now. So at some point, based on this process, equities become an incredible short, because you'll see a normal correction followed by companies trying to sell stock in order to build up their capital base, which pushes down prices even more. And there's no real way to say where the end is to something like that. When that really gets going, it becomes a full-fledged crisis. A bear market turns into an equities collapse. And so we're building up the possibility for that now too. Everywhere you look, we're building up imbalances that have to be unwound and will cause a huge crisis when they're unwound. And so the question is, do these things happen sequentially so that we can deal with them, or do they happen all at once? And that's the worst case scenario, where all these imbalances have to be unwound at the same time, and they become feedback loops for each other, each making the other one harder and harder to deal with until it's impossible to deal with anything. And that's probably the highest probability scenario right now, because when one thing happens, it will affect the other things. When derivatives blow up, they'll affect equity prices, and that'll affect pension fund behavior, and that'll affect government budgets, and you'll see everything spin out of control at the same time, and we'll get something that, as you said, we've never seen before, and so we can't predict with any certainty, because it's going to be completely uncharted territory.
This is the completely mystifying part of this process for me. So 2008. That was the shot across the bow. You had Hank Paulson at the time, then Treasury Secretary, marching into Congress in a closed-door session with his magic 3-page memo, which basically said, give me $750 billion, and you can't hold anybody accountable for whatever decisions we make. And by the way, I'm not going to tell you what I spend it on. And they said no, and put a little transparency into it. But he still got the $750 billion. And his argument was, we don't know how bad this could get, but it all kind of looks interrelated. This is a systemic thing, which is shorthand for it could get really ugly and we don't understand it. That was the moment, I think, to begin making it systemically understandable and systemically no longer threatening. And would you say are we more systemically vulnerable today or less?
Oh, more. And which is astounding, because you would think if something like that happened to your family, right, where your finances just spun out of control and you were one day away from bankruptcy, as soon as you got things under control in the short run, you would immediately start trying to simplify your life, right, and make it understandable and less fragile. And we went the opposite direction. We allowed the big banks to get even bigger, because we basically guaranteed the big banks. That was the Greenspan put, and among other things. And it allowed them to use this implicit government guarantee of their finances to expand and take market share away in mortgages and other parts of the economy away from smaller banks. So they got even bigger, and their derivatives books got even bigger, and government budget deficits went through the roof, of course, so government debt soared. So basically the fragility that almost gave us martial law in 2009 is more extreme now than it was back then. And now you've got government budgets that are completely out of control. Japan, you've probably done a lot of analysis on Japan, and your listeners know that story, but just the short version is they borrowed more money than any other country as a percent of GDP in history, and let interest rates go up by just a couple of percentage points to globally normal levels, and they're bankrupt. And the U.S. isn't far behind. And Europe is just a mess, no matter how you look at it. And that doesn't include, when you look at government debt, that's not including the unfunded liabilities of the government pension plans, which in Europe, they don't even bother trying to fund them at all. In the U.S., we underfund them grossly. And I'm not sure how Japan does it, but I assume they're making the same mistakes the rest of us are making. So you add that in, and it's another $1 million per family of four of debt that's been loaded onto the global economy. And how all this ends is completely unpredictable in the details, but completely predictable in the broad strokes. It's going to be a financial crisis that's even bigger than the one we would have had in 2009, and it's coming, and it could be coming soon.
Well, let's go to Japan for a second, because I do think it's a wonderful metaphor. It's a very large economy, so it's not an irrelevant sort of sideshow that we're tracking here. They're ahead of the United States in a demographic respect, so they are about 10 years ahead of us in terms of aging. And under current trajectories, Japan goes from a nation of about 110 million to somewhere between 65 and 35 million people by the year 2100. And so they're depopulating, and they've got a culture and laws to support it that basically don't allow a whole lot of immigration and population additions that way. So assuming that Japan is losing population as it goes forward and has more and more people entering retirement, which means that they're drawing upon their savings rather than adding to the productive side of the economy, which is totally fine. You have to step back and go, okay, so those two trends mean that on a debt per person, but most importantly on a debt per productive member of society, that is an economically contributing member of society, those numbers are just skyrocketing. And for all the people who are saying, yay, Abe has managed to, give us some slight inflation in the appearance of economic health, any competent thinking person would say, yeah, but what's the plan? Like where are you going to be in 20 years? Is debt per person going to be twice as high as it is today? And if so, how does it get paid back? And if it doesn't get paid back, who's left holding the bag? That is ultimately the only question I'm interested in these days, is who's holding the bag? Because somebody's got to pay for this, right? Somebody's got to take the losses.
Yeah, Chris, and the final solution in every case across the board is going to be massive currency devaluation, because the only way you deal with this debt is to cut it in half by making your currency half as valuable. That means the debt that you have to pay back doesn't change in nominal terms, but you're paying it back with cheaper currency. And so in that way, you hope to get out from under it. So the people who suffer from this are savers. Anybody who trusts the currency, and holds dollars or euros or yen as the basis of their financial life is going to be screwed by this, because they're the ones who are going to take the gigantic haircut. If you're Exxon, you are basically as valuable as you were in the past, no matter what the currency is doing, because you own real assets. So somebody who owns stock in Exxon is going to be okay. But if you've got a bank CD, say you got a 5-year CD yielding 1%, and your currency is devalued by 30 or 40 or 50%, that's all loss for you. Your net worth just went down in real terms by that much. And so it's yet again an example of how savers are the people who are being hurt by almost every major government's policies. And so, you're doing a great job with Peak Prosperity of helping people figure out how to deal with this. Because, we're really past the point where we even need to talk about whether a crisis is coming, right? We know it is. And we know the general outline of the solution, which is massive devaluation. So what do we do about that as individuals? That's the real question now. And so becoming more self-sufficient and lessening your dependence on the local fiat currency, all of that stuff is what people should be focusing on now, rather than even bothering to watch the news, I think. I think, some kind of a crisis is baked in the cake. It's going to be resolved through massive devaluation. And so you as an individual and your listeners should be thinking about how you're going to come through it, and possibly even make money from it. And that's what James Turk and I's new book is about. It's about how you position yourself so that you not only sail through this, but you end up possibly making a lot of money on the process, because huge changes, huge crises bring huge opportunities. things are going to go way down, but some other things are going to go way up. And so you want to be shifting out of the stuff that's going to go down and into the stuff that's going to go up in the event of a massive currency devaluation. And that's that, at least, is something that is simple enough that we can understand. We can't figure out what's going on in JP Morgan Chase's balance sheet. But we can figure out how to move our CDs into precious metals and how to make ourselves more valuable at work and how to lower our expenses. That's all stuff we can handle. And so that's really, I think, what we should be focusing on.
Oh, absolutely. So let me ask you this then: how do we experience a currency devaluation if every country has that same plan?
Well, Jim Rickards, who I think is one of the absolute best analysts of this process, says that we all do it against gold. We can't devalue against each other because that's a zero-sum game with a limited lifespan. You push down the exchange rate of the dollar versus the euro. Well, that helps us in the short run, but it hurts Europe, and they're going to retaliate by pushing down the value of the euro. Eventually, everybody figures out that the one thing they can devalue against is gold. So gold becomes $10,000 an ounce, which is another way of saying the dollar is worth 1/10,000th of an ounce of gold. And we peg it there, and in that way create a sound currency going forward. But we do that at the expense of everybody who saved dollars, because all of a sudden their dollars are now worth 1/5 as much, or 1/7 as much, or whatever, of what they were before. And so that, when you see it that way, is a fairly simple process that you can prepare for. And so the investment aspects of that play are pretty straightforward. And what becomes complicated is how you deal with the political aspects of it. Are they going to confiscate gold before they do this, like they did in the 1930s? Or are they going to empty out your bank account along the way? Or we're going to have capital controls that stop us from moving money from one country to another and trap us here before they raise wealth taxes or whatever? That's all within the realm of possibility. And it's something that we have to plan for, at least to the extent that we can. And that's complicated, but also really interesting. I think it's a fascinating puzzle to try to look through the different scenarios and come up with solutions for each one that allow you to keep at least most of your capital.
And real assets, of course, fit into that scenario for you as well, land.
Yeah, the government can't make more land. So it's going to go up in terms of dollars if the dollar goes down in value. It doesn't mean that piece of farmland got any more valuable. It just means the thing we're measuring it with changed. And so in dollar terms, your farmland goes up, your oil well goes up, your gold and silver coins go up. So real assets that the government can't create in unlimited quantities, the way it can create currency, will be the winners in this process. And you're already seeing it at the high end of the spectrum. The 1%, people who have a lot of free cash to play with, are converting that cash into fine art, London penthouses, and farmland, and of course equities now. But they're already doing it. They already see what's coming. And so we're seeing booms in those asset classes that are usually interesting to rich people. So the question is, how do we get on board? You can't go out and buy a Rembrandt. Most people can't. But we can buy gold and silver coins, store them in a safe place. We can have some bullion stored overseas for us. We can buy equities in companies that own real assets. Those would be the mining stocks and the oil companies, and to an extent, farm-related companies, although there aren't that many of them out there yet. There should be pretty soon. But so we can play this along with the 1% and benefit along with them. But then the second part of that process is, how do we keep it once we make it? And that's where it gets really challenging.
Well, it does get challenging. Obviously, it's more and more challenging. And, we're starting to see stories come out that the 1% are starting to say, hey, this might not actually end all that well for us if it turns out, all of the wealth has sort of ended up in just a very few pockets. You become Brazil. Nothing wrong with Brazil, but I mean, people who live down there who have wealth have to live with 24/7 armed guards in gated communities under the constant threat of kidnapping, extortion, or home invasion, armed robbery. It's a lifestyle, but it's not one I would aspire to necessarily. And you can see that we're getting in that direction with this gap. And so the political solution to that is to just be more and more redistributive and give more and more out through a variety of handouts in a variety of ways. And that keeps the lid on the pot for a while. But at some point, it's not possible for the government to continue doing that because they're just simply the resources don't exist for everybody to get a cut like they did in the old days. So somebody has to cough something up. Who do you think that is? Is that which side of the spectrum pays first?
Well, the way it works in reality is that the middle class gets soaked for all of this stuff because high-end capital is very mobile. It's really hard to keep track of, and it's hard to tax. You see, look at Apple's finances. They've got billions of dollars overseas that for them is very tax advantageous. Google does the same thing. They lower their taxes by spreading their money out around the world, and governments aren't able to keep track of it. And so to go after the 1% and say, okay, we're going to impose a wealth tax on everybody that has more than $10 million or whatever, well, you'd see a huge decrease in the number of people with $10 million in your jurisdiction. They would just move, and they would send their capital to some place that you can't track. And that's always been going on, but in times of aggressive redistribution, it happens on a bigger scale. So the ideal world is where you don't have these huge income and wealth disparities and where there's a lot of upward mobility. And the question is, how do you get back to that because we were once that way, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s in the U.S., wealth inequality was nothing like it is today. And but once we went to a pure fiat currency and the government could create as much of it as it wanted to and gave it to the big banks, and the big banks gave it to their preferred customers, you saw inequalities start to grow. So one thing you do is go back to sound money, which makes it harder for governments to redistribute from the middle class to the rich. And then beyond that, it gets tough because you can't do overt redistributive policies that affect the 1% because you can't catch them. And even if you could, you end up with a system that makes the government even more powerful, which leads to more inequality. So it's not easy to see how this works, and that's why Latin American countries have been such a mess for such a long time. They began with basically oligopolies, with a few families ruling everything, and ever since they've been trying to become more egalitarian societies, and they can't do it, and that's why you have these recurring crises in Latin America. And so now we've created a situation where we're in kind of that boat, where our income and wealth inequality is comparable to Argentina's, and so it's not clear that we can do a better job than Argentina or Brazil have done in the past, because it's not easy to get huge amounts of money away from people who have acquired it and who can move it around the world. And so, I don't know what the solution is. I know sound money is part of it, and maybe the biggest piece of it, because once you go back to a sound money that doesn't allow you to play all the games that the big banks and the world's governments have been playing, you reimpose morality to an extent on a society, because sound money is really a moral issue as much as it is a financial issue. It means you have to keep your promises. Governments have to maintain the value of their promises, which, a piece of currency is basically a promise that if you hold on to it today, you'll be able to exchange it for something of equal real value sometime in the future. Governments have been breaking that promise consistently since 1971, and that moral corruption has bled over into every other aspect of life. So, if we go back to imposing financial morality on governments, that's a start. And then beyond that, I wouldn't even pretend to have a solution.
Well, even that start is going to be quite the trick, because last time I ran the numbers, in order for the U.S. federal government alone to close its budget deficit, they could tax 100% of the income of everybody earning over $250,000, 100% tax, and it would just about close the gap. So there's obviously a big gap between income and expenditures. Japan's got a huge one. Europe's got a huge one. Those sorts of things are, I don't see any way around it personally, except for people to square up to reality and say, hey, we kind of promised ourselves a little bit too much. Looks like we can't have those promises. How are we going to close that gap and do that in some sort of a fair way? But everything since 2008 has taught me that we're not going to do this the fair way. We're going to do this the other way.
Yeah, because how do you tell people who are dependent on government-run healthcare that they're going to get much less of it. They're not going to get that operation they need because the money isn't there. While you've got a group of people who are just insanely rich, and a bunch of big banks that are just running rampant, committing crimes and paying out huge bonuses based on the revenue from those crimes. And you won't be able to do that politically because the people you're trying to take money from are going to say, no, take it from those guys. And so then you end up with a system that looks an awful lot like Eastern European central planning, which won't work either. That you're going to lose the wealth creation vitality of a society if you try to take too much from the capitalist class. And so you can't do that. Then you get something out of Atlas Shrugged, where they just disappear. Capital just goes on strike. And so, again, I'm not sure what the solution is. I mean, we all have to take less, obviously. We've all made promises or been promised things that we're never going to get. And how we get from today to a general acceptance of that, it's hard to see how we do that without it being incredibly messy and full of strife. That's why governments around the world are preparing for civil unrest. Mm-hmm. And they recognize that their financial policies of the last 30 years have led us to this point, and that any fix is going to involve a lot of trouble. And so they're preparing for riots in the street and domestic terrorism and electoral turmoil in which every election is a throw the bums out event. And so you've always got new people in charge, and they're always failing to live up to their promises. And that's what we're looking at on some scale. And it doesn't seem like we can avoid it. And I think governments recognize that. And so they're planning for, we were told in 2008 or 2009 that we were a day away from martial law. Mm-hmm. Well, if that's the way it was then, with all the increases in financial leverage and fragility, there's no reason why we can't see that again. So, we could see something politically out of 1984 if we don't watch ourselves. Yeah. And we're creating the conditions for it. And so, I think that on the political side, obviously financially, we've got to do the stuff that we just talked about. But on the political side, we should be educating ourselves so we can make the case when the time comes for sound money, limited government, individual freedom, a return to basically constitutional principles, so that there are enough people speaking out for those things that maybe we can offset the people who are saying, well, this was a failure of capitalism, therefore we need a dictatorship. And that's going to be a hard argument to win when this all blows up, because it's going to look like it was capitalism's fault. But, you inherit your times just as you inherit your family. You can't really do anything about it. You have to be part of your time. And that argument, I think, at some point is going to be the defining trait of our time, and we need to participate in it.
And to be clear, we haven't really been practicing capitalism for quite a long time.
No.
It's been something it needs a different name. But I laughed before when you said we're going to 1984. I was just thinking about how it just was revealed that some researchers were using Facebook with DARPA money to find out the impact of using social media. If you just fed people happy stories or let them see a little bit more of the reality of the world, could you steer how people's emotional responses tended to be? And the answer was yes, of course. So they would specifically tighter or limit certain people's news feeds to just sort of happy stuff. So here's how you know that the revolution has arrived. You're going to go to Facebook and you will only see posts about cats and kittens on your Facebook feed, and you'll say, "Wow, it must be bad out there, I guess, today or something."
Yeah,
because they are preparing. But to me, it's obvious that the government is clearly concerned, and they've militarized our police forces, and they're investigating ways to shape our perceptions, both overtly through the media, which most people have cottoned on to, but also more subtly by doctoring our news feeds and our social media streams. And guess what? It's all fair game. I think that's what that day away from martial law taught me, was that when the people in power get that scared, anything's possible. Literally anything can be rationalized after that. Buy the stock market? Pff, come on, that's the easiest thing on the list. I'm sure there's much more interesting things on that list when you get right down to it. So that's the world we live in. And so I guess in closing, for me, the summary, the only thing I can take away from this is the more manipulated the markets get, the higher the stock market goes against all reason, and the equity, the bond markets, and all of these markets, the higher they go against all reason, the more I'm convinced that it's my personal duty to be as prepared as I possibly can be, mentally, physically, financially, emotionally, all of that, because my faith in a small, non-elected group of people controlling the uber markets with precision is zero. I have zero faith in that outcome.
Yes, it's going to end badly. They're going to mess this up one way or another.
Yeah.
And so, but it's completely beyond our control. So it's time to tend our gardens. It's time to take care of our own lives and embed it in our communities as possible, and know that that's going to be the unit when the time comes. We're meet with and trust and deal with face to face. That's going to be the group that saves us when the time comes, and who we participate in saving. And so it's time to get going on that.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. So, John, thank you so much for your time. We've been talking with John Rubino. He runs dollarcollapse.com, and that website, go to it. It's got a lot of great information on there, a couple of really great articles up, 3-parter actually. And the most recent book, The Money Bubble, and that's at Amazon. You can find links to it on his site. It's all there. John, anything else to how people can follow you?
No, that covers it, Chris.
All right. Well, do. He's got great stuff, obviously, and it's just always a pleasure talking with you, John. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Chris. Enjoyed it.
Thanks, and I'm going to return to this playground we call Maine and the Maine coast. So if anybody's
have fun.
If anybody's heard some stray noises in the background, that's because this is on the road. So with that, John, thank you so much for your time, and I hope to talk again soon.
Thanks, Chris.